You know what you're listening to?
Is that a trick question?
It's the I Still Love This Game podcast with your host, Matthew Damian.
He's an idiot. Don't listen to this. He's an idiot.
Hello and welcome to the I Still Love This Game podcast. It's been a week. It's been a week since the Last Dance concluded, and I purposely waited before giving my thoughts on the last two episodes and the entire series altogether. And you might be asking why. It's not the first time I've taken a hiatus from the show, but the reason was simple. I wanted people that watched it to decompress a little bit and give it a little bit of time, a little bit of space before they started to get some meaning from it. I didn't want to immediately jump into giving my opinions on it. I wanted people to come up with their own opinions with it. And then once they've formulated those opinions, listen to what I have to say. Then you can agree or disagree with me. That's the beauty of, the platforms we have, the life that we live, is we have an exchange of ideas and opinions. So I purposely waited. I watched the episodes 9 and 10 again. I actually watched them on Monday. I couldn't get enough of it. I thought it was fantastic. So Sunday night watched it. Monday watched it again. And it was fascinating. It was really strong television. And I don't like to call it a documentary. It's more along the lines of a video form of an autobiography, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. The documentary, it's not, and I kind of wince as well as when people say it's not journalistic, but you see what journalism is these days anyway. If journalists were doing their job, I wouldn't have to do this podcast. But the reality of it, it was a fantastically entertaining. There wasn't a whole lot there. A lot of people sort of jumped at the flu game and they said, well, holy crap, it's a food poisoning game. That's been sort of thrown around for a long time now. And all you've had to do is pick up a book to read it. Michael Jordan, The Life, by Roland Lazenby talks about it. Playing for Keeps by David Halberstam, which I think is the greatest basketball book ever written. Talks about it. So it's not anything new. And there's, of course, rumors that he was actually hungover, which I don't know. I mean, we'll never know. All we can say, he was under the weather. He clearly wasn't 100% physically. But regardless, people sort of jump up and down at that. And that's okay, because I'm not saying that in a condescending way, like, oh, I already knew all this stuff. It's good that people have these, a little bit more context applied, a little bit more information and education applied when they're talking about Jordan or they're thinking about Jordan and stuff, some of this stuff, because it's far too easy to just look at stat sheets. It's far too easy to just look at winning percentages and try to determine who the best player is or how good a player was even, because you need to have that additional context. And without that additional context, it's all for nothing. Basketball is an art. It's not a science. So with that rant out of the way, let's actually talk about episodes 9 and 10, and then I'll go over a little bit more of what I found important and riveting out of it, and yeah, let's go with it. So we're going to start. Obviously, they started episode 9 with the Pacers and Bulls rivalry, and also that series, and of course they started it with the Reggie Miller Jordan fight in '93. And what I find very interesting, and I'm going to talk about this later on though, is Reggie Miller was his biggest rival at that position. And that, I'm not trying to disrespect Clyde Drexler, but Clyde Drexler didn't bring it in 92. Reggie Miller brought it in 98. And Reggie Miller really developed into a player. There was some similarities with Reggie, and I had a friend back in Australia. He was actually from New Jersey, but a huge Knicks fan, massive Knicks fan. It was kind of funny. He was older. He's a lot older than what I am, and I won him over by, we were talking because I was wearing a Scottie Pippen jersey, and he was saying Pippen was garbage and all this other stuff, right? And he asked me who the greatest Knick of all time was. I think he was expecting me to say Patrick Ewing or Willis Reed or whatever. And I said Bernard King before he even finished his sentence. And we became really close friends. His basketball knowledge is very, very high. But there was something that he pointed out to me, that there was only 2 players that he was actually really, really afraid of as a Knicks fan going into a game. One guy was obviously Jordan. And he did not have a lot of complimentary things to say about Jordan. But he said one guy was Jordan and the other guy was Reggie Miller. And you can see why when you look at the 94, 95, 98, and 2000 series, just how Miller lit them up. And even the 93 series as well. You know, he played very well in that series. So it's good to see that Miller, who was his biggest rival, was actually saying that Jordan has nothing to apologize for. Because Reggie Miller has one of the biggest hearts, one of the biggest competitive fires that you'll see in any team sport. Because he delivers more times than not in big games, and he raises his game in the playoffs. A lot of players' production will go down. Miller's went through the roof in the playoffs. And that's a big reason why he's a Hall of Fame player. His regular season resume, probably not warranting it, but his performances in the playoffs were legendary. And there's very few players that can actually say that, especially when you're talking about, you know, his ability. He's very underrated from a clutch standpoint. But in the late 90s, he was revered. You know, Jordan was clutch. Jerry West was Mr. Clutch. But Reggie Miller was, you know, on the next... You know, obviously Larry Bird was clutch as well in terms of their performances and big shots, but Reggie Miller was on the very next level down. So he was held in a very high regard. But what Miller, it's funny because throughout this documentary, we've seen a lot of backlash from ex-Bulls teammates. And as I said, we'll get to that in a minute, but what you see and some of the stuff that Jordan was saying in terms of his mindset and what he was thinking, and what his motivations were. But it's funny when you look at Reggie Miller, who is you can still see that he is upset over what happened in Game 7 and the fact that they lost that game and that series. But Reggie Miller is able to put that to the side and say, look, he has nothing, he being Jordan, he has nothing to apologize for. It's just the way that he was thinking, and look at the results. You can't argue with the results. So it was very refreshing to see that kind of stuff from Miller, especially in the wash up of this series. It's kind of funny. It's almost like we're talking about a playoff series, like a playoff run that's actually just happened. In terms of the reactions, Jordan was likewise very complimentary towards the Pacers, and you know it's almost like a forgotten rivalry because they only met once in the playoffs. It's not like the Knicks, where they met, what was it, 4 times in the 90s, but also they met in the late 80s as well. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like Utah when they played twice. It wasn't like Miami, which they also played twice. We didn't get that repeat performance, that encore, so to speak. But Jordan said that they were the toughest tests that they faced outside of Detroit. Obviously, they played Detroit as well, multiple times. And I thought that was an interesting choice of words because you take away Game 4, and Game 4 came right down to the wire, and the Pacers played it came down to a hell of a shot. It also came down to missed foul shots by Pippen, a loose ball which could have gone either way in terms of the call. It went to the Pacers, and Jordan shot at the very last second. Or last half of a second, very nearly went in. You reverse any of those things, you know, you're talking about 4 or 5 things that had to go right for the Pacers to win and even that series. You reverse any one of those things, and we're talking about a 3-1 lead, and as Miller said, that's a death sentence, going back to Chicago for Game 5. And even if you're able to somehow get it out of game, like bring the series back to Indiana, you still have a Game 7, and we know what happens there. So for it being so close, it was very, very close to being a blowout, a 4-1, and that's shows how what a fine line it is in the NBA playoffs when you're in that situation of either being when it's a 2-1 situation, how close it is from being a tied series or, as Miller put it, a death sentence. This was the only series as well during with the exception of course, the 1990 series against the Pistons, that the Bulls didn't win a game on the opposing team's home court. We had some close instances. The Sonics in '96, the Bulls won Game 3. They lost Games 4 and 5. The series they lost against Orlando. Of course, you can include the '94 series, I guess, if you really want to, against the Knicks. But I'm of course talking about when Jordan was playing, because the '94 series against the Knicks, the Bulls won all their home games, but didn't win in New York. But speaking of New York, '93 was very close to that. But of course, Game 5 they had won. Every single series they had at least won one game on the road, with the exception of this one. Jordan calling it a bump in the road was taken a little bit out of context. I think he meant that not that the Indiana Pacers were a bump in the road to the championship. I think he meant that Game 3 was a bump in the road in that series. But it was just really the peak of it. Like, not the peak, but it was actually the start of the ascension that they had to go over to win that series. The shove. People want to talk about the push-off from Jordan on Byron Russell, but yet they don't want to mention this. This is a flat-out shove. I don't mind it not being called. I really don't. It would have been. It really would have been a sucky ending, especially with what I said too, and what Miller said as well. If that's the end of the series, essentially, because they go down 3-1. If that's the reality, if that's what really ends it, you don't want the officials to, you want some drama. You want to see the players determining it. And I get it. He did push him off. He did absolutely run up to Jordan and shove him as hard as he could. Jordan went back only a couple of inches, but it was enough to create that separation. But shows Miller understood how to work the refs maybe better than anybody. And you got to give him kudos for that. Malone and Stockton. It goes back to the '97 series against the Utah Jazz, so the year prior, and the flu series and all that. We'll get to that in a minute. But people talk about Jordan being lucky or ducking Hakeem Olajuwon, and I wrote about this in the book. Because there is a chapter of Olajuwon versus Jordan. And what is forgotten about it is Jordan made the finals 6 times. Olajuwon made it twice. One time Jordan wasn't there. It wasn't even in the league. The other time he had just returned back from baseball. So if we're weighing it up, Jordan was there 3 times as much as what Olajuwon was. And yet we don't say that Olajuwon ever ducked Jordan. We don't ever hold Olajuwon accountable for not seeing that matchup of Olajuwon versus Jordan in the finals. Just something interesting. But what I will say is somewhat controversial, and I'm only talking about on the offensive end, even though Karl Malone's a very good defender as well. I think Karl Malone was a better offensive player, or more versatile offensive player than what Olajuwon was. Olajuwon was not a great pick and roll player. Karl Malone obviously was. Karl Malone was also a better passer, especially to cutters. Olajuwon was very good at finding the open man that was coming to double him, and they would just be standing still where it was Mario Early or Sam Cassell, Kenny Smith, Robert Horry, obviously, and they would just be taking wide open threes. Those passes are a lot easier to make than what Malone was usually making, which was often in traffic, whether it was Hornacek or Stockton or Byron Russell or whoever it was that would be cutting. So passing, I think he's better. Ball handling is kind of like a wash. If I really have to give an advantage, it's probably to Olajuwon. But it doesn't make a huge difference because they weren't handling the ball all that much. They weren't really breaking guys down off the ball. Olajuwon was probably a little bit better at facing up. Karl Malone was a lot better at running the fast break. Both excellent jump shooters for their size. I would give the advantage to Karl Malone. And obviously back to the basket goes to Olajuwon. Much, much better in terms of that. But that wasn't a weakness for Karl Malone either. Karl Malone was very good in the post. The point I'm making in all of this is I don't think we would have seen any difference if Olajuwon and Jordan met in the finals. We would have seen the same outcome we had seen between the Utah Jazz and the and the Bulls. We would have seen the exact same thing if it was Houston versus them. Because let's keep in mind that on both journeys to the finals for the Utah Jazz, they went through Olajuwon. They went through the Houston Rockets. And those teams were a lot more talented, at least on paper. You know, they had multiple Hall of Famers, although not quite to their peaks, but they were the same age as what Jordan was. They were the same age as what John Stockton and Karl Malone were. So we can't give them the age as the excuse. It's not like they were 45-year-olds playing against a bunch of 28-year-olds. They were all in their mid-30s. Game 1 of the 97 finals, the one where Jordan sticks it to Byron Russell. Fascinating insight where he's saying that if you watch the Hall of Fame speech, and a lot of this goes back to the Hall of Fame speech too. He mentioned this about Byron Russell in the Hall of Fame speech. It's kind of funny that everybody, when I say everybody, most of the media, said that they hated that Hall of Fame speech and it was a disgrace, it was embarrassing, all this other nonsense. But yet they love this documentary. It's the same thing. It's really the same thing. A lot of the content is the same, especially the stuff with Byron Russell. But what I really liked was when Jordan was saying, like, hey, he's on his toes a lot, he jumps around a lot. And I think it was Bill Walton who was on the call for NBC. He said that Russell stabbed at the ball. I don't know what he was thinking when he was doing that, because the clock was running down anyway. So all he had to do was get up on him and really, because he was, he recovered fairly well to Jordan's shot. I mean, we're talking, like, even though Jordan was when he went up to release the ball, he was fairly wide open. But Russell, half a second, not even that, between him and getting towards his hand to close out on. If he was closer, we could have seen a block shot or something like that. And if he was closer, I think Jordan would have gone straight to the basket. Similar to what we saw in Game 6 of the 98 finals, where, the last minute Jordan goes straight to the basket, gets by Russell gets a hand on the ball. If you see the baseline camera on that camera angle, and we'll talk about this in a minute too, Russell gets his entire hand on the ball, but Jordan is able to overpower him and still get the layup up and off and in, obviously. So I think he had figured out Russell very, very well, very, very early. Like, hey, Russell, I can either get to the basket or I can shoot a jumper. Russell couldn't counter both of them. But leading into that, obviously Malone winning the MVP, but they didn't talk about Malone missing the foul shots. Malone was actually fouled in the last 10 seconds of that ball game. It was a tie game. And Malone missed those 2 foul shots. It led to Scottie Pippen saying to Karl Malone, because the game was on Sunday in the United States, he said to Karl Malone at the foul line that the mailman doesn't deliver on the Sunday. One of the great trash-talking lines of all time. And of course, Malone bricks 2 foul shots. Jordan comes back, buries a jumper, and they win the game. As the series moved on into Utah, it was very interesting. Obviously, it goes into the flu game more than anything, which is fair enough because that's an iconic performance by Jordan. But the Bulls had, think about this. With Jordan, since 1990, they had never lost 3 straight games. We know this, right? I'm assuming we know this, but based off the reactions to some of the stuff that I expect people to know, I guess maybe they don't. But the Bulls had never lost 3 games with Jordan in the 90s. They were up 2-0. Utah came back. They won the next 2 games. In dramatic, they blew them out in game 3, and then in dramatic fashion, they won game 4. Really, the Bulls choked that game away. Stockton played the game of his life in that game. I can't remember who said it, but they said it was the greatest pass I've ever seen a point guard make, and I cannot dispute that. The one where he after a Jordan miss, Stockton gets a rebound and then just heaves it down court to Karl Malone for a layup. Jordan just beating Jordan's outstretched hand who was trying to pick it off. One of the great passes, one of the great moments in NBA history. Maybe the biggest or the best moment in Utah Jazz history outside of Stockton's shot that actually sent them to the finals, which was a couple of weeks prior to that. So the entire momentum is with Utah. And that's with a healthy Jordan in games 3 and 4. Then Jordan gets sick. Utah already had all the momentum. Home court advantage, a significant advantage for the Utah Jazz back then. Not just because of the crowd, but also the altitude. Then Jordan gets very, very sick. Whether it's food poisoning, alcohol poisoning, or whatever, right? Whatever it was, he wasn't feeling great. Utah jumps out to a 15-point lead. Everything is going their way. And this is why I think Jordan's the best player of all time, and it's not even close, is his ability to dictate pace and control momentum. It's just incredible. And this might be his best game given those circumstances. And I am a huge fan of the 98 performance in Game 6. And as I said, I'll get to that in a moment. But what he was able to do in this situation, these circumstances, was incredible. It's hard to even put into words. And it's not even the 38 points. But it's the 44 minutes, given that situation. Some players might be able to give you 30 minutes. But to play nearly every minute of that game, I'm struggling to put it into words. Because you're already, you could just see how exhausted he was physically. And, there's that picture of Pippen almost carrying him off the court, but the video of him walking off the court, and when it actually shows not Pippen, not the front on video, but it's almost like a side on back view of it, Jordan is barely holding on. It's Pippen that's holding on to Jordan and making sure he gets off the court. That's how weak he looked. And yet he was still able to produce what he produced. Made the game-winning shot, which was a 3 after he missed the foul shot. I was always of the opinion that the game 6 in 98 was his best game. It was his most important game. But I think the flu game, the food poisoning game, whatever you want to call it, may have been his most impressive performance. And what was equally as impressive, and they didn't even talk about it, was he backed it up in Game 6 with 39 points before he ended up passing it to Steve Kerr. Also, an incredible moment, obviously, to hear Steve Kerr's opinion or perception of what went on and how he actually, how that play came to be. And it was an indication of just how Jordan was seeing the game from a mental standpoint. And I think he referred to it as the craftsmanship. Like the athleticism was deteriorating a little bit, but now we're getting the craftsmanship. And I think he would have been an excellent coach had he had the patience to deal with some of this stuff. Then it switches back to the Indiana series, and they don't talk about Travis Best coming through with a great performance at the end of Game 6. But what is also not mentioned is Derek McKee tripping Jordan as Jordan was taking that drive to the basket at the end of Game 6 to try to end that series. And the point that I'm making with some of this stuff is there's a perception that the Bulls got all these calls. And some of them went their way. But I think it all balanced out. because just in this series with the Pacers, we talked about Miller's pushing off. We get that loose ball after Pippen's missed foul shot that went to the Pacers. You get the Derek McKee one where he trips Jordan just at the end of Game 6. You had the one where Rick Smits gave Jordan stitches, and there's no foul call on that play as he's blocking the shot. There's a lot there that actually happened that the Bulls didn't get calls for. So it wasn't like what we see now, especially with, not now, but what we saw with Shaq or, players like that, where they just get superstar calls. Obviously, these things happen. It's the NBA. It's the unfortunate reality of the NBA. But it was definitely not the case it's blown out to be. I thought it was kind of funny that Jordan had his own locker room, his own office in the locker room. And it goes back to that thing before where I said he's almost like a coach. He was on a different level to the players. But this wasn't the first time we had seen it. Obviously, we had seen it in previous episodes with Randy Brown and when they were playing quarters and stuff like that with the security guards. But it was just very interesting that Jordan needed a break from his teammates as well. Reggie Miller, after a very, very hot start. And this game, people want to bring up comparisons with Kobe and Jordan. Not so much anymore, but I think that's a much better comparison than LeBron and Jordan. But they want to bring up those comparisons. But this game reminded me of Game 7 between the Celtics and the Lakers in 2010, where it was just an absolute war. You had the road team full of veterans, but that's, of course, being the Celtics. They jumping out to a hot start, double-digit lead for them, and then not a great shooting night by Kobe or Jordan, but they both realized what needed to be done, and they hit the glass. They rebounded well. They played excellent defense. The turning point in that game, which really wasn't talked about, was there was one scene where where Jordan was during a timeout in the huddle saying that he's not switching on anything. He's going through every screen. They made that switch. Harper was on Miller for the majority of that series, and Jordan made that switch, and Jordan was now on Miller, and that's really what slowed the Pacers down, because the Pacers got out to a very, very good start. Jordan was the one that shut down Miller in the second half, and that was a much bigger factor than anything else that happened in that game, including the jump ball with Jordan and Rick Smits that Jordan won, or Steve Kerr's shot. Tony Kukoc didn't get enough credit for what he did in the third quarter, really kept them in the game. But what Jordan did on the defensive end was incredible. Speaking of incredible, the dialogue between Jordan and Bird, these guys are both of these guys are the epitome of a man's man. And just after that loss, I can't remember if it was Jordan coming out of the press conference area or if it was Larry Bird, but they ran into each other. And and Larry Bird says, "You little bitch," and Jordan says, "Fuck you," and they he starts roasting him about his golf game that he now has time in the off season to work on his golf game. I love that stuff, but the respect is there. There was no hostility. It was just like, they're both testing each other. They're both eyeing each other. I would have loved to have seen the 80s Celtics up against the 90s Bulls. That would have been, if I could have a dream matchup to watch a 7-game series, that would be it without any question. Then, of course, it goes on to game 1 between Utah and the Bulls. We're in 98 now, obviously. And that was really Stockton's last great game. It was a really, really good game. But it was his last, obviously we're talking about a great player. One thing you can say about John Stockton, he was very consistent. But after game 1, the Bulls completely shut him down. And they did a pretty good job of shutting him down outside of game 4 of the 97 series too. And that's an underrated element to their success, is they knew how to shut down certain players. They knew who was important. Now, Karl Malone, very important too, but they knew by shutting down Stockton, you're also shutting down Hornacek. You're also shutting down Byron Russell. And then, let's see if Karl Malone can beat us. And there were times that Karl Malone beat him. Game 3 of 97, Game 5 of 98, very nearly Game 6 of 98 too. But by shutting down Stockton, I think Phil Jackson said it in the locker room. He was referring to what a good offensive team this Utah Jazz team really was. And that's what makes Game 3 even more impressive. Because you had these guys, Stockton and Malone, who were the best at running the pick and roll of all time. It's not even close. And just look at their resumes. You've got Karl Malone, second all-time leading scorer. John Stockton, all-time leading assist player. And they were geniuses when they were running the post. The pick and roll. They knew exactly how to exploit defenses. They knew how to collapse defenses. They knew how to. They just knew how to run it. They were masters at the pick and roll. And yet they were only able to get 54 points. Some teams now, and this is not a reflection of, the NBA being better now than back then, but the lack of defense is, you sometimes get 45, 50-point quarters in the NBA now. This team only got 54 in the NBA Finals. And they had won 62 games that year. It's incredible to think just what an amazing job they did defensively on that Utah Jazz team that was full of weapons. And if you need more of an example of how good that Utah Jazz team was, they beat the Rockets in the first round. The Rockets were up 2-1 in that series, so they had to go through 2 elimination games, 1 on the road. Then they went through, albeit a rookie Duncan, in the second round. David Robinson was very good, but when I say a rookie Duncan, he played 4 years in college. So it wasn't like he was 19 or 20. He was 22, 23 at that stage of his career. So he was seasoned. And the very next year, he should have been the regular season MVP, but he led the Spurs to the title. So he wasn't that far off it, off his prime. And the Jazz took care of them convincingly in 5 games. Then they swept Shaq, and Kobe obviously wasn't quite yet Kobe, but he was still very, very good. He was an all-star. He was coming off the bench. Del Harris, you can thank for that one. Eddie Jones was an all-star. Nick Van Exel was actually an all-star. I don't know how he made that all-star team. Robert Horry was on that team. That Lakers team in 98 may have been the most talented roster that the Lakers had with the Shaq and Kobe run. And of course, they were absolutely demolished by the Utah Jazz 4-0. So think about the Hall of Famers they went through. Think about the All-Stars they went through just to get back to the finals. And then they win Game 1, and then they lose Game 2, and then they only held to 54 points. It's crazy to think like that. And the other part of it too is the Bulls won Game 2, they won Game 3, they won Game 4, and they only lost Game 1 in overtime. So despite the Jazz having basically 2 weeks off because they swept the Lakers, so they had all kinds of time to prepare, rest up. They're an older team as well. The Bulls had 2 days rest, or 2 days in between Game 7 against the Pacers and Game 1 on the road too, by the way, in Salt Lake. Yet the Bulls came within 1 overtime of actually sweeping them. That's damn impressive when you think about that, at their age too. And how differently will we actually be talking about it? Now, of course, we don't get Jordan's Game 6 performance or Karl Malone's Game 5 performance either. So I'm glad it worked out the way it worked out. But, had they had swept Utah, oh my goodness. And Game 5, I just mentioned that as well, that, we wouldn't have got that. That really showed how good and how mentally tough Karl Malone and the Utah Jazz were. Malone's performance, that 39-point performance, was incredible. Because he's going up against Dennis Rodman. He's going up against the help defense of Ron Harper, Scottie Pippen, who was starting to show signs of that back injury, though. Jordan, all these guys that were swarming him. It was for him to deliver that the way that he delivered it on the road in the same environment that he missed those foul shots the year prior, up against Jordan, who had by far and away had his number. Karl Malone struggled the first 4 games of that series. And Jordan, I'm trying to think what the record was at that stage. It would have been, 6? The Bulls would have had 9 wins to 3 losses to Utah in those leading up to Game 5. That is a terrible percentage. It's almost like LeBron's finals percentage. I couldn't resist. But the reality is he stepped it back up, Karl Malone, and he almost single-handedly took that series back to Utah because, I've spoken about Jordan not having a whole lot of offensive help. Karl Malone didn't have a whole lot of offensive help in that series because the Bulls were so good defensively. They took away Hornacek. They took away Russell. They took away Greg Foster, who was playing very well in the regular season. They took away all those guys, Howard Isley, Stockton, they took them all away, and it was pretty much just Malone, and Malone still dragged that series back to Utah. Kind of reminiscent, honestly, without the great performance, but like in terms of the letdown game, though, it's kind of reminiscent of what the Bulls did in the 93 finals. And you already had 2 championships. The first 2 championships of that three-peat, so 91 and 92, and then 96 and 97, the Bulls had home court advantage. This is the year that they didn't. They ended up being up 3-1 in both situations, with the opportunity to finish it in Game 5 at home, and they were unable to do so. And then they had to go into a hostile environment for Game 6 with the possibility of a Game 7 staring them right in the face because of that letdown. So what I got from it, though, was Jordan was just unshakable from a confidence standpoint. And I don't want to contradict myself because in a matter of 30 minutes or however long I've been talking for. But that Game 6 performance in 98 will go down, I don't know. The Game 6, the flu game was incredible because you've got the added element of obviously him being sick, right? But the fact that what he did was an absolute masterpiece in Game 6 and 98. I don't know which one's better. I really can't. There's no wrong answer there. A very, very gutsy game by Scottie Pippen. For everybody that's ragging on it now, including Pippen saying, it makes me look bad or whatever, just this has been very much a truth-telling series. And did Pippen not go into the game in 94? Of course he didn't. He didn't do that. Did he sit out, the first 40 games, essentially, because he didn't get the surgery in the offseason? Of course, that's what happened. Was he unable to play because of the migraine? These things happened. Whether, just because they're not glossed over, the truth is only offensive to liars. And there was not a whole lot of lying going on in this. And I'll get to that in a minute when I talk about my final thoughts on the entire series. But the reality of it, though, when there was truth to be told about Scottie Pippen, it was also it wasn't just a negative thing. It's not like they glossed over Pippen's sacrifices in Game 6 of 98. And the way he played through it is spoken very glowingly by Jordan, by Tim Grover, Chip Schaefer, all those guys. They all mentioned Phil Jackson. There's that great scene of where Phil Jackson asked Pippen, can you start? And Pippen says yes, and Phil Jackson nearly falls over. He's like, he couldn't believe that he was actually ready to go. So when the opportunities were there to speak glowingly of Pippen, they did. It's not like they just ragged on everybody. There was just a lot of truths that were exposed in this that a lot of people didn't want getting out there. But when you're talking Game 6 of the 98 finals, it comes down to that last minute. And this doesn't get mentioned enough, but nobody else on the Chicago Bulls team touches the ball in the last minute. Jordan ties the game with 2 foul shots. Then it goes down to Malone on the block. Malone makes a cross-court pass to Stockton, who buries a 3. Now all of a sudden I think it's 86-83. I don't have it on. It's kind of scary if I'm right on that. But it's a 3-point lead for Utah. Jordan, they call a timeout. Jordan gets the ball. drives right at Russell, and as I said before, Russell gets his entire hand on the ball as Jordan's making the move, about trying to strip Jordan. He just can't get it out of his hands. Jordan's just way too strong for him. And Jordan, it's not like Jordan puts his shoulder in or anything like that. Jordan just goes up. Antoine Carr nearly blocks it as well. So it was a hell of a shot, an incredible shot. And it doesn't tie, but it cuts the lead to 1. Once again, no other ball touches the ball, unless if you're going to count Scottie Pippen's inbound pass, but that doesn't count because that's not live. The Jazz, they don't call a timeout. They know what they want to run. Malone, exact same play as what they did a second ago. Malone is on the block, isolated. But if you look at the previous play, the help came from Scottie Pippen from the top. And Ron Harper, because Scottie Pippen's man, I think it might have been Keith. I don't know who it was. Or Antoine Carr. The other big man for the Jazz. Because Pippen's doubling Malone, Ron Harper has to slide down defensively to cover Pippen's man. And Harper closes out very well on Stockton, but Stockton has enough space to get the shot off. But the help came from the top side of the court. Now, with this play, the one where Jordan gets a steal, the help comes from the blind side. So if you wonder why Karl Malone has tunnel vision towards the top of the key, it's because he thinks that's where the help's coming again. This is totally on John Stockton, by the way. John Stockton's the one that throws the ball into Malone. He had the perfect vision, the perfect angle to see Jordan come back, and he doesn't alert Malone. He doesn't do anything. Now, of course, it's sort of like a rough thing it's a brutal way of saying it's Stockton's fault. It's no one's fault, really. But if Malone's going to get blasted for it, then really it should be Stockton who gets blasted, because Karl Malone can't see that. Karl Malone can't see over his right shoulder when he's looking over his left. It's impossible. And Jordan was so quick in the way that he pounced on that, gets it clean. Once again, no other ball touches the ball. And I love the fact that they didn't call the timeout. It was if you understand American football, it's kind of like they've tied the game, and they've tied the game. They've scored a touchdown. They're a point away from the extra point away from actually tying the game, but they go for 2 to win it on the road. Let's go for it. Let's roll the dice. Definitely wasn't a push off. Everyone says it was a push off. If you look at how much Jordan extends his arm, it's virtually nothing. So if Jordan really caught, like Bob Costas has that incredible line when he says it's like a maitre d' showing someone to their table. It's hard to argue that, but Russell was already going. And if Jordan had that kind of strength, then he's the strongest human being in the history of mankind. Because it was more to balance Jordan himself. Now, is that a foul? No, absolutely not. If they're not going to call the Reggie Miller shove, if they're not going to call all the other fouls that we saw, because it's such a physical series, you can't then all of a sudden call that one. And I do like the fact that they did the picture of the crowd and how shocked they were, and the ball has barely left Jordan's hand, and so it's nowhere near even going in just yet. It's just in the air, and all the Jazz fans are in shock. David Halberstam was the first one. I've already mentioned that book. He was the first one that pointed that out. They didn't have Judd Butchler at the end of the game saying, "You are fucking unbelievable" to Jordan after he did that. They just had Jordan saying, "I had faith." It was almost too perfect. When you look at it, it was such a clean ending. Like, you talk about the missed shots and everything like that, but the one thing that I noticed when I watched this game again is Jordan never gave the same move twice to Bryant Russell or Shannon Anderson or Jeff Hornacek. Every time he got it, it was something. He might spin over his left shoulder, power dribble, raise up. It might spin over his right shoulder, power dribble, then step back, then jumper. It was always something different. He had a counter for everything. It was totally unguardable. And it was when you if this was written and there was no footage of this game, I wouldn't have believed it. I really wouldn't have. That's how clean, that's how precise that was. But the very classy act by Karl Malone by going onto the bus to shake the hands of the Bulls and congratulate them. I don't know if he knew that was his last moment, really, in the finals. I'm not going to count what happened in 2004. But they never even got back to the conference finals. That team, they were on their last legs too. Malone played so well in games 5 and 6. As this, like, I've got a friend who listens to the podcast, Jordan Walker, actually. And I said to him, that when they did a reunion of the Jazz, I think it might have been the 97, or it could have been the 98 team, but they did a finals reunion for that Utah Jazz team. And I said to him, this feels like a championship team, and the teams that they went through and their dominance and everything like that. Even more so than a lot of those Spurs teams or even the Rockets teams. Some quotes from Jordan, where he said that scared the shit out of me, referring to Game 6, because we don't associate that with him. We think he's, as I said, the confidence is unshakable and everything like that, but he's still human. And it's easy to think, well, Jordan's Jordan, he's never going to lose or whatever. He could very much lost that. And then, of course, referring to Phil Jackson's coaching techniques as that Zen Buddhism shit, which I thought was hilarious. And then, of course, unfortunately, it goes on to the breaking up of the Bulls. And the reality is we got no closure. And some people are saying it was actually good that they never lost. But I don't want to sound hypocritical here, because my opinion really doesn't count on this either. But their opinion doesn't matter. If the Bulls want to keep going with it, they're the team. If Jordan wants to keep going with it, Rodman wants to keep going with it, Jackson wants to keep going with it, if Pippen wants to keep going on with it, Kukoc, all those guys, if they want to keep going with it, they should be given that opportunity. If they want to, that's their team. Did it work out from a legacy standpoint better? Maybe, but it's their decision. It's their call. It's their careers. And it doesn't take away anything, really, what they had accomplished. It's not like if they had lost in 99 or if they had lost in 2000, then you take away 98, you take away 97, 96, 93, 92, 91. That doesn't happen. Those championships still remain. The false perception that they were invincible, because as I said before, and this is when Jordan said that, that scared the shit out of me. Because they were vulnerable. They could have lost. That might go anyway, but that's an incorrect observation anyway, because they weren't invincible. No team ever is invincible. And it's kind of funny because they wanted to rebuild so much, and ever since this happened, they've been rebuilding. So I hope they've had their taste for it. And the fact that Jordan found it maddening that they weren't able to keep the run going until they lost should surprise no one. Because he's the ultimate competitor, but as I said, there's no closure. So as the ultimate competitor, he's probably thinking, could have won 8, could have won 9, could have won 10, could have won 11. He's probably thinking that. And as I said, it shouldn't be surprising whatsoever. Look at everything. As a rookie, turning that team around, to the broken foot, to going to baseball, to, winning a three-peat before going to baseball, Detroit, everything, overcoming Detroit, then winning 3 more titles and setting the world on fire again. He was the ultimate competitor. But the impressive thing about it was when he got there, it wasn't like Bill Russell when he went to the Celtics and there was already Bob Cousy and Red Auerbach. It wasn't like Magic going to play with Kareem. Kareem was already there. It wasn't like Kobe when Kobe had Shaq. LeBron had no one as well. Yeah, but LeBron couldn't win in Cleveland, so he had to leave to Miami. And then he came back and Kyrie Irving was there. Jordan had no one, and he built that up from the ground up. Now, had LeBron found a way to win in Cleveland without going to Miami, then you can make the comparison there. But it was disappointing to see it ending that way. I think it deserved a better send off than, if you won 6 titles, if you take, if it takes you that long to get to the top of the hill, and then you're on top of the hill, no one can knock you off. Why not stay there until somebody does knock you off? And there's a couple of misconceptions that people have thrown out there. They said, the lockout season would have been perfect for them to win their 7th title. And that would have been terrible for the Bulls, because even though it was only 50 games, it was a crazy schedule, because that season didn't start until late January, I believe. And you had 50 games in 3 months. So that would have been a real hard schedule on an old Bulls team. But all they would have had to do was sign Jordan, Pippen, and Rodman, really. Because Tony Kukoc was still in a contract. And the other side of it too is, if the rest of the league knew that Jordan and the Bulls weren't getting broken up, there's a good chance that lockout doesn't even happen. Or it doesn't affect any games being played. Because the Bulls meant so much money to the league, they weren't going to throw that away. They could have had the lockout another time, because it was that significant. Takeaways from this. There's been a lot. And the biggest takeaway that I got from it was Jordan's quote saying, "Winning has a price. Success has a price. And you have to be willing to pay that price. And it's going to be a sacrifice." I love that. It's one of the more powerful, concise quotes that you can get. Because if you want anything in life, you have to be willing to pay that. You have to be willing to put the work in. You have to be willing to give up friendships or relationships that are bad for you or negative towards you. It was a very, very strong, powerful quote from Jordan. The other thing it shouldn't be surprising, is just how the media is starting to attack him again. And it's, with the Isaiah Thomas stuff, with the Scottie Pippen stuff, the Horace Grant stuff, they're all doing well, it's not so much Pippen, but definitely Horace Grant, definitely Isaiah Thomas, trying to, politic their way in and weasel their way in to getting their point across. Why don't they just create their own documentary? Why don't they create their own series or their own autobiography? If they really feel that way, let's hear it. But, some of the players, Kendrick Perkins called Jordan a snitch. For what? For what? It's just crazy. And once again, the standards are so skewed, because there's nothing that can attack him from a basketball standpoint. There's nothing that can attack him from, if the standards are correct. So they have to lower the standards or drag the standards or have a higher standard for Jordan as opposed to everyone else. He can't even respond to something or give his point of view on something. It's insane to me that that's the actual reality of it. And you can just imagine what it was like in the 90s. Because this is just a recap of what happened in the 90s. So you can just imagine the scrutiny that Jordan was under. And it makes why he walked away a couple of times all the more sense, because that's got to be frustrating. That's got to take a toll. To be that successful and that loved, he really was untouchable, because he really went up against the media. The media were looking for any and all opportunities to drag him down. And I got a little bit heated in the previous episodes when I was talking about the media and what, how disgusting and disgraceful they were in their treatment towards him. But it's not much has changed. Very little has changed in terms of when there's it might be because of you don't align with him politically, and he's apolitical, by the way. So that, or you might be an Isaiah Thomas fan, or you might be a Magic Johnson fan, you might be a LeBron fan, you might be whatever, a Kobe fan. So any and all opportunities to drag him down, they went for. And I thought it was interesting that we didn't. I wonder if LeBron was actually invited to speak, because he didn't play against Jordan. I know that, but neither did Barack Obama. Neither did some of these other commentators, or quote unquote expert opinions out there. They didn't have to play against him. Grant Hill would have been interesting to talk to. Shaq, Penny Hardaway. I would have loved to have heard what they had to say. But at the end of it, he is untouchable. No matter what happened, no matter who he was going up against, people. The fact that he was so genuine. Clay Travis mentioned that he was very comfortable in his own skin, and that allowed him to be genuine, and that's how people actually responded to him. And that's probably why the media hated him. Like, I'm putting words in Clay Travis's mouth here because he didn't expand it. What Clay Travis was saying was, you were getting, sometimes people will say things based off the knowledge of what they think you want to hear. Jordan never did it that way. Jordan would just be honest with you and just say, this is how I feel. And I think a lot more people respect that, and in turn like that, than this whole pussyfooting around and trying to be a politician, trying to, play to an audience, all that other stuff. Because people, say what you will about my generation, we've grown up on the internet, and we are very skeptical about what people say and what their motivations are. So we can see through BS a lot more times than not. So that's probably why the NBA is not as popular as it is now. You can only, stats lie. Effort doesn't. We can see when players are playing hard and whether they're just trying to pad stats or not. And when it comes to Jordan, the fact that the ratings are so high now for this series, he's more loved than ever, probably. Now, the media will hammer him. They will really hammer him. And I may do some response videos, because you're going to get a lot of misinformation, a lot of lying, a lot of twisting of facts, manipulating again to try to paint certain people in a better light than what they actually really are. And I will probably be debunking a lot of those, or at least giving my opinion on a lot of those. But that's basically my take of it. It was an incredible run. The night I wish that it was more based on the 98 season, the behind the scenes stuff, but it was incredible to watch. It adds a lot more context to a lot of this stuff, a lot of these stories. It debunks a lot of criticisms or unfair criticism or falsehoods, and I think context has now been applied to Jordan's career that you may not have had unless if you wrote a book about him. So I hope people enjoyed it. You don't have to agree with all of it. I didn't agree with all of it, but I hope it was entertaining. This has been a hell of a time for it to come out, and it gave, I would hate to have thought what the quarantine would have been like without it. So kudos to ESPN, kudos to the director of it, kudos to Jordan, kudos to the Bulls, kudos to everyone involved, because sports is a great escape. And for the first time in a long time, despite everything going on that has gone on in the world in our history, we haven't had live sport to be that escape. This documentary allowed us, even retrospectively, and we may not agree with this stuff, but retrospectively, it's allowed us to have that escape happen as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hey, this could have been an episode itself. This is nearly an hour of me talking about any edits. I am exhausted. If you have no idea how difficult that is to talk for an hour with only some dot points and basically just talking off the top of your head, you should try it sometime. It's not so easy, but it's in the books. I'll see what happens in terms of some of the responses coming through the media and stuff like that. And I might just do a question and answer mailbag episode as well. But I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed the documentary. I hope you enjoyed the book. Keep sending me the feedback with the book. I'm enjoying hearing what you have to say, what you agree with, what you disagree with, whatever it is. But have a great day. Have a great weekend. A great Memorial Day weekend, excuse me. And I'll see you on the next episode.